In this video, I'm going to be talking about how you do a artwork formal analysis. This is a method that you can use when you're looking at an artwork to figure out what your thoughts are about it, why you think it's interesting or not, and even dig into the meaning of the art based on what you see, using the elements of art, the principles of design, and your own judgment and interpretation. These are the questions that we're going to be answering as part of our formal analysis. So as you can see, there's 4 sections: description, analysis, interpretation, and judgment. To get full credit on this summative assignment that you're going to be doing, you'll need to make sure that you're answering each of these sections with at least 3 sentences or more. As you're doing your explanations, you should make sure that they make sense and that they're well thought out. So to show you how this is done, I'm going to be using an example artwork. This is a public art piece that's located in Chicago and is called The Flamingo by an artist by the name of Alexander Calder. This is a sculpture that has been around for quite a long time and is pretty familiar to people that live in Chicago. And it's just a really popular piece. You can see it's very large. It takes up an entire square between some buildings, and it's very much so durable. This has been sitting out here for decades. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a description. For description, we're going to describe the work. We're going to see what it looks like, talk about what type of sculpture it is, and then we're going to make sure that we talk about the elements of art and how they're seen. So when I'm looking at this artwork, it appears to be made out of metal. I can see that because of the rivets that are between the pieces, and just thinking about what material could be used to actually hold up against the elements of being outdoors. It's very large. It's red. It stands out up against all the buildings that are a dull color. So now I'm going to just pinpoint out some elements of art. So the first one that I'll talk about is something called color, and I mentioned color already. We talk about this being red, and it being something that the artist chose to do. The entire thing is the same color. It's all this red that's really bright. What we see as different values within the color is simply because of how lighting is hitting it. I'd also want to talk about how shape is being used. Within the different sections of the sculpture, the artist chose to work with a variety of geometric shapes and some organic lines that are kind of going along the edges of the sculpture. So certainly line could be another one that I talk about, as I was just mentioning. It's very easy to kind of flow from one element of art to the next as we're looking at one of these artworks. So again, color, shape, line. I don't want to talk about those 3, but certainly you could make the case for a lot of other elements of art. For example, anything that's 3-dimensional, like a sculpture, is going to be form, and this definitely takes up 3-dimensional space. I could talk about space and how there's all these sections that you can see through in the sculpture that are negative space. And that plays a pretty big role, especially with that negative space that people can walk through underneath the sculpture. So that fits into the description part of our formal analysis. Next one is going to be where we actually analyze the art using something called the principles of design. So all of the elements of art build into the principles of design as to what makes an artwork interesting. So when I'm looking at the sculpture, I could talk about quite a few of the principles of design. The first one I'm going to talk about is scale. Scale is when you're making something that's really, really large or really, really small compared to things that are around it. So in this case, I'd probably talk about how the sculpture is massive. You can see the size of the people that are right up next to it, and how the sculpture really does take up a lot of space. It's very large. It's very impressive in that way. Maybe I'd want to talk about how the sculpture really stands out up against the background. There's some emphasis going on through contrast. The red really stands out up against the dull, drabby colors of the buildings around. Maybe I'd want to talk a little bit about one of the other principles of design called unity. Unity is all about having something that's very similar. And in this case, the color brings unity to the entire artwork because it's all the same red. And you could look at the principles of design as you're looking at an artwork and determine which one is most important to you. Because all of our eyes work differently and they may see something a little bit different. As long as you can explain it really well, your answer could work for you. You just need to be able to back it up with the elements of art. Next, I'm going to talk about the interpretation. So I'm going to explain the meaning with how I'm seeing it and try to pinpoint some things that are standing out to me in the sculpture as to why I think it means a certain thing. So looking at the artwork, it's called Flamingo. I know that from reading the title of the artwork. So in terms of what the artist had meant it to mean, it's probably trying to represent the shape of a flamingo as it's leaning down to eat something. Knowing the name of it helped out a little bit with what the meaning might be, but I also am looking at this artwork and realizing it doesn't necessarily look like a flamingo. There are some, the color is red, it really stands out, maybe like a flamingo pink would stand out. But besides that, there aren't a lot of things within the sculpture that really do look like a flamingo. So I think that it's trying to show how minimalism can be used. Minimalism is an idea where you take out as much as possible from an artwork, and you're just focusing in on the shape and the form and the color and the line and how those can create something that holds interest. So perhaps minimalism is where the artist was headed with this one. I think that too, just putting something in the middle of a city where all of these buildings are just straight up and down, and they're very, they look like they're standing upright and they're very strong. Whereas this sculpture, we know it's pretty strong, but it doesn't really hold the same dimensions as a building would. It's curved, it's elegant, it's leaning over, connected on just a few points. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is something called judgment. So I'm making a conclusion in my own mind about the artwork. I want to talk about whether or not it's interesting and talk about why. What are things that are going well in the sculpture and what things do I think, could be improved or aren't really holding my attention very well. So when looking at this artwork, I find it pretty appealing. I'm looking at it and it holds my attention. It's something that I wouldn't mind spending some time looking at. But at the same time, when I'm looking at it, some parts that aren't as interesting to me, when I look at it, I really like the curved lines. I like how those draw my attention and move my eyes around. I'm not as fond on the large bulky triangles that are kind of out in this area and over here. I feel like those are so different than these areas that they don't necessarily seem to go as well together to me when I'm looking at it. So overall, yeah, the sculpture is interesting to me. I think it's really unique to have a sculpture that's so large in a space, and in that way, create some interest to me too. So as we're looking at our formal analysis, I want you to do the same type of thinking as you're looking at an artwork and deciding what you think it means and why you think it's interesting or not. So really the description and the analysis help you out when you get to your interpretation and judgment section of analysis. So just make sure that you're really giving yourself a good explanation. Imagine that somebody couldn't see the artwork and they were just going off your description and your analysis and all of your other paragraphs here to figure out what it might look like. All right, so that's formal analysis.